Very good afternoon and welcome to this first edition of the National Security Dialogue for 2026. We have today a very interesting subject, which is securing India in a volatile region. We've already had a long year in terms of security in 2026. It's the end of the first month, but seems to have been a long, long year. We had Venezuela, Greenland, Iran, Davos, many conversations there, more on security than on the economy. Uh, we also have a situation. Today is a very special day with a lot of hype about the mother of all deals that has been signed between India and the EU. And among them is, of course, also a security and trade deal, apart from a mobility agreement that India and EU have arrived at. Uh, for India, we live in a tough neighborhood. We have two traditional adversaries on the north and west, China and Pakistan. We have two countries which are considered failing or in advanced stage of turmoil that have been Afghanistan and Myanmar. Both saw change in government, coups of sort in 2021. We also have various degrees of unrest that we've seen in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Maldives, in Nepal. We also live in an area where we are reminded very often about the problem that India faces of cross border terrorism. We have issues of infiltration, but yet India doesn't have any equivalent of a Monroe Doctrine for South Asia. India does not believe that there is a case for hegemony here. But the big powers remain active in our region. We've seen the United States, we see China, which are active in our region, and India does not really object to their presence, but does is pretty conscious of that. We also meet in the context of the US having released a national security strategy in December, followed up by a national security defense strategy in January. No, it doesn't have too much on India, but it does provide us context. And I'm going to ask our panelists at some point to also reflect on whether India should have a national security strategy and a national defense strategy. But we will dive straight into our discussion with our panelists. We have a great panel with Rachel Rizzo, to my right, Senior Fellow in the Strategic Studies program at ORF. We have online, I see my friend Air Marshal Dr. Diptendu Chaudhary, former commandant of the NDC. We have Atul Kumar, who's a fellow at the ORF, who's been driving this program. And we have one panelist stuck in traffic, and hopefully she'll make it before long, which is Professor Srirada Datta, Professor of International Affairs at the O.P. Jindal Global University in India. We are going to be talking of four framing questions, which we've already shared with the panelists. These are on securing frontiers, on options vis-a-vis the United States and the Pakistan factor. We have one on the third issue that we'll talk of is deterring China and below the threshold of war. And the fourth issue we talk about is critical minerals, the new choke points, and the solutions. So this is the security landscape that we are talking about. And let me start with you, Air Marshal, straight away on the question of how would India secure its maritime and continental frontiers in this volatile region without surrendering strategic autonomy. maybe we'll give all our panelists about 8 minutes each to have their opening thoughts, and then we'll get back to you with more questions, and then perhaps we'll of course open the floor for the audience questions. So over to you, Air Marshal, for your comments.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ambassador Pasari. A pleasure to be back on a forum with you, my fellow panelists, and all the attendees of this very important and interesting discussion today. So I'll just, since there are just about 8 odd minutes, I'll just jump into it straight. Maritime and continental frontiers. The question itself, I have a frankly, I won't say a problem with it. I want to make a point here that this is precisely a challenge which India has faced, is looking at our border issues and our frontier issues and our security perspective only from a two-dimensional surface-centric perspective. We talk about frontiers, we talk about borders, we talk about the maritime spaces, yet we don't talk about air. And very strangely, this has been missing in our security narrative and dialogues for the last 2 decades. And the last serious employment of air power was 71 war, in which it was full-fledged use. And I think the Sindhu has reminded us its salience once again. So I think first I think this, probably we need to take a wider look. I would suggest that we need to look at it more holistically when we talk about national security. But with that in mind, I think I would like to make a distinction here that the continental threat is a clear and present security threat, and has serious consequences, whereas the one of the maritime domain is a little more of a strategic perspective of not an immediate security threat, but one in the long term. And that is what I would like to sort of emphasize here, because IOR is still some time away for regular and active presence, a disrupting presence of the PL Navy. So right now, I think our focus from it and where things are a lot more, the criticality is a lot more on the continental domain. And I say this mainly because when we discuss about how do we operate in this region without sort of ceding to China's larger game and without ceding a strategic autonomy, we have to bear a few things in mind. One is that our outlook has been fundamentally defensive in our construct. We talk about defense at all points in time, and even in fact, even when the military talks about offensive, it is for a larger defensive construct of safeguarding and preserving our territory. So that is one aspect we need to bear in mind. Second is, when we look at the LSE and the border-centric approach, we have actually kept it underplayed for a very long time, left it at the tactical level to the Indian Army, and of course with the necessary, if I may say, foreign office intervention. I mean, from our MEA, whenever necessary and required. But this has a disadvantage. Keeping it at low and a tactical level has given the strategic space to China over the years. So every time we had an issue on the border, we settled it, we came to some agreement, and we took our eyes off the ball. And this has given China a strategic window to build up their infrastructure at rapid speed, and yet keep us on our toes with their salami slicing tactics, which has been evident. It was localized in certain areas, not spilling over to a wider region, clearly Ladakh, Arunachal, and now the Shaksgam Valley. And I would suggest that this is something which will continue. And I don't think we should, fall into the trap of getting taken by surprise again and again. The points are very clear. So we need to look at it in a very different perspective. And so I think we need a greater understanding of air power and how can we leverage air power in a two-dimensional construct. Do remember the PLF has a huge role to play. The PLA was deterred from progressing in Galwan and Doklam simply because the speed at which the Indian Air Force and air power built up. We have a distinctive asymmetric advantage, but this advantage has a very small window because of declining numbers, and more importantly, the rapid pace of infrastructure build-up, air power infrastructure build-up by the PLAF, the PLA Air Force in Tibet. And I would also suggest that right now this build-up though it is taking place at a rapid pace, it has this the fundamental focus of the Chinese is on Taiwan and on South China Sea. So the day that issue gets resolved, I think things will take a dramatic change in this region. But notwithstanding that, we have already seen the presence of fifth generation platforms already in the platform in the airfields in the region. There's a rapid increase in the number of deployments, and there has been air violations which took place some time back. But the point I'm trying to bring out here, the border construct, which we looked at it from a two-dimensional point of view, has a vertical connotation of sovereign Indian airspace and increasing Chinese forays into this, increasing violations, air violations bring in an entirely new dynamic. I'd like to leave it one couple of quick thoughts on this again. When we talk about neutral zones and buffer zones, there's a danger here where it will serve the Chinese purpose much more effectively, because if you bring in sovereign airspace, that means now I can't employ air power in a buffer zone in the vertical domain. It restricts our air force tremendously from our ISR operations, patrols, and border monitoring. So bear in mind that today I would argue that there's a need to include the Indian Air Force. Firstly, include the vertical domain much more seriously and actively in our threat construct. Include the Indian Air Force in border talks. This has been raised by the Air Force several times, but it gets turned down from the point of view that the PLA doesn't bring their Air Force on board. Now, that is, I think, a dangerous argument to make, but it gives them the space. They understand that they are a PLA dominated, the Air Force comes under PLA army in a larger construct, and they carry out all the conversations. But I don't think we should shy away from that, and we should insist on bringing our air power into the discussion. And I think I'll end at that, give enough time and space for others. I do have about a minute or two left. I'll just mention this, that we need to take a fresh approach out here. And there is a lot we can do employing air power from our side. I think the government is seized of this matter. We are building up air assets rapidly, but notwithstanding that, we are challenged by our capacity of our air power, because the numbers are drastically in the favor of the Chinese. They already have the fifth generation in the vicinity, and in the near future, they can be expected to bring in the sixth generation platforms and change the dynamics in Tibet. And do understand our fifth generation platform is a decade away. So I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amash. Thanks for introducing the air element here, which by default is often forgotten. But I just want to ask you in terms of a follow-up on technology. You mentioned sixth generation, and India is still far away. What about drone technology? How critical or important is it going to be for security going forward, and where does India stand there vis-a-vis either of our neighbors?
So I understand exactly where you're coming from in this, because drones and missiles are the flavor of the season. But I would argue that it has become a default setting in most militaries. It was picked up from the Ukraine war, where the Ukraine war was drastically restricted because it didn't have air power, and the Russian Air Force, which had a very strong air power, does not employ air power offensively the way the West does. So that gave space for the growth of drones and the necessity for the employment of drones more aggressively. Now, where does it impact us? The way the drones have been used on the tactical battle spaces against the Indian army, I beg your pardon, against the Russian army and vice versa, is something which is what worries most armies, and especially the Indian army. So the drone proliferation is there. The Chinese are using it, but to understand in those high altitudes, there are limitations in the usage of drones in the way they have been used in other wars. So bear this in mind, but they will have increased application in ISR and most certainly in some kinetic aspect. From an air power and larger use of drones, they are as vulnerable as any other aerial platforms, and bear that in mind. Yes, it would probably reduce some of the lethality of manned platforms, but that is an arguable debate because we do have a large manned air force, and building a drone air force entirely is a bit of I think, a dangerous way to think about. So I think a balance of force is something which is what will be needed in the future. So drones will play an important role, but I will argue here, drones will not win you wars. They might win you tactical situations, but they will not win you wars. What will win you wars are conventional forces even now, because simply our threats are conventional at this point in time.
Thank you. Let me take this question to Professor Srirada Datta, who's joined us now. Uh, basically, take 8-10 minutes to talk about the same issue. How do we secure our volatile region?
Uh, so if I look at the region just now, I mean, it really looks like the one of the worst case scenario building that we always done. Everything seems to be falling away from us, and there's the internal dynamics that's working against us. There's of course the neighborhood is in a kind of a flux that we don't understand. So so far as India is concerned, I think we still say that Op Sindoor is in continuation. It's something that we it's out there, but also we've seen the kind of larger geopolitics which has emerged subsequently to what we faced with them in last year. So at this point of time, in fact, right now when we speak here, the Myanmar foreign minister is in Islamabad. We've seen how Islamabad and Dhaka seems to have converged. There's all kinds of new dynamics. Nepal, of course, is up in the air just now. We do hope that the new youth engagement that we are doing there is going to, bring us a little more stability in the months to come ahead. But we've also seen how things have changed. I mean, Sri Lanka, of course, is been a good case for us. We've seen somebody who was at one point of time extremely anti-Indian, and then, of course, has changed positions ever since been in the government space. We've been able to work very well. As of now, a defense agreement was something that we were very happy to conclude. But of course, as we are aware, there are many other agreements that we were looking for, especially on the energy line. I think there are some ifs and buts on that. But certainly, in all of this entire scenario, while Bhutan is still considered a very dear friend, we also know of new alignments that emerging. We still seem to be very much in control, but rest assured, the rest of the other countries, which also includes Sri Lanka, which right now is on the very good page with us, and Maldives to some extent, I think we have a lot of security issues emerging from everywhere. One, of course, is about whether we ever think and we ever envisage in terms of using, a war-like situation. So far as the neighborhood is concerned, apart from Pakistan, I think the rest of the problems that we face, especially right now when we're looking at Bangladesh, is actually the cross border issues that we're looking at. So, at one level, I mean, we know about how this is notwithstanding West Bengal politics, West Bengal elections, and Assam elections, there is a certain amount of, internal migration which has changed the course of the political landscape in not only just West Bengal and Northeast India, but the rest of India. And I think while I have a lot of issues about the way SIR is being conducted in West Bengal, but it's a fact that some, potent, uh, potent possibilities of some kind of, issues coming up will probably has to be addressed to SIR at that point. As we see, of course, SIR and Assam has been a very different way that they've handled it. So that again is another problem that we've seen in the months to come. Just now, if we are looking at it, I think the way I see it, the two elections which are coming up, and now if you look at, and I'll specifically look at Myanmar to some extent, we know that the entire, though for the first time we actually heard ASEAN say something very harsh on the elections and that they don't accept it as farcical, but I don't think they really care. It's been really for their own internal dynamics that they did what they did. And given the fact that we've just heard about how Iran is going to be supporting Myanmar with air missiles and all of that, it does certainly look that all these other energy factors and other ethnic groups, which we thought in the last couple of months, we've seen a whole lot of them come into Delhi, talk to us at various forums and say how they were consolidating themselves. But under the present circumstances, when we see NUG, the juntas back in business, it looks like that ethnic groups that we were talking to, and we probably thought that there'll be some amount of, stability emerging, is not the question here. We, of course, as the government of India, has always worked with the stable factor, which is the military junta there, and of course the government. And while in the internal sense, I think our issues have been on the northeast, and they have in the past delivered. But the fact that like, we are not able to increase, while we have these cross-border issues, we also know that India spent for the last decade and more a lot of time, energy, and money on the cross-border facilities. Much of that we built with Bangladesh, and I think that's something that we always wanted to say, that we've gone back to the pre-65 days, now lies in a vacuum. Our Kaladan port, which again, as you know, has been in the making for ad nauseum years, also again because of the fact that now it is quite clear, and given our fact that we have always said that the only stable factor is the military, is the the junta there, that we are not able to, while we have used some of our good offices within the ethnic groups in the northeast to talk to the ethnic groups across the border, it isn't something that we've been able to do enough to assure them that we won't be using any of our strength against them.
Thank you very much for focusing on these three countries, especially Myanmar, Bangladesh, Nepal. And if we have time, I'm going to come back to you, to ask you if you agree that the Myanmar generals seem to be drawing lessons from the Pakistani generals, because at some point Pakistani leadership and generals realize that perhaps better than having a military coup is to have a veneer of democracy, because that helps us negotiate with the world better. So maybe that is the lesson they've learned in this last election, to rig it and then develop that veneer of democracy. But let me come right now to Rachel on the other issue that concerns us, and that is the United States, and particularly in the security context. We have many bones to pick with the Trump administration, but one of them is the way Washington has courted Pakistan, or vice versa, and that we feel has an impact on regional stability. So how do you look at the US-India ties, particularly in the security context?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. I just moved to New Delhi in December after spending the last 13 years in Washington, and that's great and fun because that means I get to try to explain Washington to new audiences. But it also leaves me in a very difficult position of also trying to explain some of the decisions and actions of our current administration, which becomes more and more difficult as time goes on. But nonetheless, I'll try to do it to the best of my ability if possible. When looking at the relationship with the United States, the advice I give our allies and partners, not just India, is that you have to look at this relationship as a spectrum of managed convergence rather than alignment. And if you can view it through that spectrum, I think that you will find that there are many issues that, while maybe not fully aligned on, can still offer a framework for broader cooperation. I think when it comes to Pakistan, I think India can compartmentalize cooperation with the US and focus on deepening ties where these interests converge. So looking at things like deterring China, looking at maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, looking at cooperation on defense technology, supply chains, while at the same time refusing to subordinate its Pakistan calculus to US preferences. I think that there's a way for India to raise the cost of US-Pakistan indulgence without, fully dramatizing the relationship. So consistently highlighting, I think, how military assistance or diplomatic rehabilitation of Pakistan undermines not just credibility in the realm of counterterrorism, for instance, but in terms of broader regional stability. And I think what's interesting about India is that it has structural rather than coercive leverage here. So I think Washington, at least the way that I view it, increasingly views India as indispensable, not just to regional security in the sense of it looks at it as a balance against China, which may or may not be agreed upon here. That may or may not be how India sees itself, but I think it's how many in Washington look at India at the moment. But it also offers a partner to the United States in a different way that I think Pakistan simply cannot. In that sense, I think Pakistan is seen as a declining transactional partner. It's not seen as the same indispensability that India is viewed through. And I think that there's a few different ways that India can go about this. I question the role of our Congress at the moment, just in terms of how they can balance against the executive arm of the U.S. government at the moment. But there are strong bilateral ties when it comes to members of U.S. Congress and members of the Indian decision-making polity, I would say. So making sure that these issues when it comes to the U.S. relationship with Pakistan perhaps aren't brought up in a super public way, the way that the Indians are able to do that with Europeans, but on more one-on-one private settings with members of Congress or with study groups and experts that come here to India quite often, and even more often now that had been in the past. I leave it to high-level decision makers in the U.S., someone like Jake Sullivan, who might not be in a governing presidential administration right now, but who has been very, very public about the degree to which the U.S. administration, the current U.S. administration, has been willing to sort of not necessarily throw away its ties with India, but damage its ties with India in favor of its relationship with Pakistan. So you kind of look at how members of the U.S. decision-making class are talking about this, and it's very much a public, ongoing debate. And so I think the benefit that when people come here and how we can sort of do this on a less public stage might be more helpful, especially given how this administration responds to that kind of outward pressure. And then finally, I think in terms of this relationship specifically, strategic redundancy can act as a hedge here. So making sure that India diversifies its defense suppliers and partnerships so that political swings don't translate into strategic vulnerability. So what I would say the bottom line is that India's choices lie in numerous aspects of regional security here. So things like building credible deterrence, diversifying its partnerships, hardening its economic and technological resilience, and then most of all, making sure that India retains its decision-making control across domains. And this isn't just in terms of its relationship with the United States, it's in terms of how India looks at its relationships across a broad spectrum of regional partners, but also global partners as well. And I would point to the relationship with Europe as a whole, and also on a bilateral basis as well. So I'll go ahead and stop there.
Okay. Thank you for that, Rachel. I think you raised a couple of interesting issues. We could have a whole session on the United States, so we don't want to get into tariffs and the whole complexity of that particular issue, which occupies mind space. But India is playing the calm, long game and realizes that the U.S. relationship is beyond tariffs. It's beyond even Trump. Administrations are transient. But do you get a sense that there is a sensitivity or a lack of sensitivity in the United States to India's concerns in South Asia and all the issues that we talked about, particularly Pakistan, which I would agree is a series of transactions rather than a structural move, but also Bangladesh. Do you feel there is a sense of in India that that the U.S. administration is tone deaf on India's concerns within South Asia? So is that the sense in Washington, or is Washington so divided that there are multiple views on this? But speak about South Asia. What is the U.S. view on South Asia?
I don't necessarily think it's a lack of sensitivity. I think it's a lack of understanding. I think what we're seeing currently in the United States is the understanding that many people have come to over the last 20 years, but that Washington, I think, as a whole is finally coming to, that India is an indispensable partner. And what does that mean for the way Washington engages, not just with India, but throughout the region as well? And I think that's where the difficulty comes in, because you have, and this kind of gets into the way, Washington has structured itself over the last 20 or 30 years. You had a lot of experts come in the early 2000s focused on counterterrorism, but focused on a different region. And then those experts sort of shifted to Russia and China. And now you have, I think, sort of a shift where people are starting to understand that they might not understand South Asia in the way that they need to make decisions that both, benefit our allies and partners in the region, but that also show a understanding of regional dynamics as well. And I would go back to what I was saying before. This is where I think bilateral conversations and things like working groups and expert discussions really, I think, get downplayed sometimes, but that are key to getting people in Washington decision-making circles to really understand the regional dynamics at play here in a way that they haven't been understood in the past, and in a way that they are still underrepresented currently at the moment.
Okay, great. So let's move to the other elephant in the South Asian room, which is China. So, Atul, to you on how should India deter China? You, of course, heard the Air Marshal talk about the complexity of the China challenge, but both on the line of actual control and in the Indian Ocean, especially when the PLA operates below the threshold of war.
So 2025 was one of the better years for us. If you remember, we had the October 2024 Kazan summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. And since then, the relationship has been in some sort of repair mode. So last year, we had the visa access becoming easier, the direct flights were restored, and somehow there is a lot more stability on the line of actual control. But that does not mean that the structural competition which is there between India and China has gone away. Like, as we saw in Operation Sindoor, Pakistan received a lot of support from the Chinese military, especially in ISR domain, on the space intelligence. And if you look at the Indian Ocean also, a lot of activity has been happening in terms of Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, Chinese development of all these bases, whether it is Hambantota, Chittagong, Gwadar, Djibouti. A lot of activity is going on. Now, the factor is, the threat can be graded. When it comes to LSE, we had three levels of engagements. We said to stabilize the LSE, we need to have a disengagement of troops, a de-escalation of troops, and de-induction of troops from that theater. Disengagement has already happened, but de-escalation and de-induction has not happened so far. Even today, more than 50,000 to 60,000 troops are deployed from each side on the border. Partially because the problem is on the Chinese side, it's a plateau. So, and also the infrastructure build-up on the Chinese side is pretty good. But on the Indian side, it's high Himalayas, and the infrastructure is not that good. So the speed at which the Chinese can bring their troops to the border is far more than what we have. So a spatial, dimension of this de-escalation can never work. We need to come up to some sort of temporal dimension so that de-escalation and de-induction can happen. But the fact is that the LSC has become militarized, and it's going to be for a while. Now, the second issue is, as of today, Chinese attention is not on this side of the border. Actually, the Chinese attention right now is on the eastern side. There are reasons for that. In 2027, Xi Jinping is coming up for renewal of his tenure, not a re-election, but actually the next mandate. And this will be the fourth time he is looking to become a president, and his succession is not clear yet. And also, you have to remember that he is 70 years old. So he needs some sort of justification, and Taiwan reunification is a big justification for him. Now, the problem is the PLA is not ready. You look at the PLA's inventory, it has a lot of fancy toys there. I mean, you look at the Air Force, you look at the Navy, it's it's probably the largest Navy in the world. The Air Force is inducting, gadgets and fifth and sixth generation of aircrafts, like in dozens and hundreds. But when it comes to the human factor, the PLA is not that strong. If you're watching the news for last 10 days, there is an ongoing purge of the topmost two leaders from the Central Military Commission of China. One of those, Chang Yoxia, is actually the childhood friend of Xi Jinping. Both of their fathers worked in the same military, and they have grown together. They know each other pretty well. And Xi Jinping used Chang Yoxia to somehow, run his entire anti-corruption tirade inside PLA. And now, after he has been purged, after his associate Liu Chen has also been purged, in the entire Central Military Commission, there are only two people left: Xi Jinping and one Chang Chengmin, which is basically his Iraq dog. He has been the head of CCTI, and he has been the crucial person attacking all the senior military officers and purging, in the last 10 years, more than 110 senior military officers. And when it comes to the junior ones, that the number is in thousands. The problem is Chinese military is like, it has a lot of this patronage network. So if there is a senior officer, he has his parent unit, and a lot of officers he has promoted and pushed up. So if one general is caught, his entire patronage network gets into trouble, and and it's like a authoritarian, totalitarian kind of dictatorship. So if you're caught, it's just like an annihilation of your entire social circle and financial circle. So if this happens at the top, at the apex of CMC, the PLA officer cadre is pretty scared as of today. Now, the fact is that PLA is also very intimately linked with the party, the Chinese Communist Party. So chances of having a coup or leadership elite fragmentation is pretty low. But the fact is, she is gradually moving into a territory where the instability inside the PLA and instability inside the Chinese political system is growing. And somehow, how it works for him and how it works in terms of Taiwan scenario is yet to be seen. One of the reasons which is being offered today is both generals which have been purged right now, they were a bit slow in improving the PLA's preparedness when it comes to Taiwan unification in 2027. She is in a hurry, but they were not. They are professional soldiers, and they wanted to go step by step, improving the joint operations capability of PLA and improving the people factor in the PLA. So Xi has completely discarded them, and he is looking for at least one or two generations below, some sort of deep selection of officers to run the PLA. How far he will be successful is yet to be seen. Now, some of the, these threats are already there, but she is also getting powerful because when it comes to India, we also have a lot of economic dependency on China. Now, you look at some of the core sectors, for example, clean energy, chemicals, heavy machinery, solar panels. Our dependence on Chinese economy is more than 70%. Our bilateral trade deficit has already crossed $100 billion. So the problem is, if your economic dependence goes far more than what is required, your strategic autonomy also suffers. Thankfully, as long as Xi's focus remains on the East, we are a little bit safer. But we also have to remember three main issues. When it comes to China and India relations, the treaty say we have a lot of treaties with China, but the treaty is an instrument for Chinese, although it is a commitment for us. We believe in all the lines and regulations of the treaty, but Chinese take it as a floor, and on that they have to build up whatever their capabilities are. Second is ambiguity. Chinese never talk about clearing ambiguity. Ambiguity can be used as a weapon. And finally, time. We believe that over time we'll have far more solutions with China. We'll develop a lot of norms and relations with Chinese. But what the Chinese officials do is they use time as a weapon. It's not to create a solution, but rather to become a solution for them. So when it comes to the India-China relations overall, we have some time. We can use these time, as long as he's involved in the East, to build our own infrastructure, our own inventory, and our own, forces. How far we'll be successful, we are yet to see. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ask you two follow-ups. One, you talked of instability, and clearly what she's facing is some kind of turmoil, which makes him want to do the purges. We saw with Pakistan that internal instability spilled out, because a part of the reason for the Pahalgam attack, as most of us agree, was regime consolidation, because the regime was unstable and Asim Munir wanted to consolidate, get people rallying around the flag and so on. So is there a possibility of a similar dynamic in China? You mentioned Taiwan. Would Taiwan consolidate the regime better? Does India need to worry? Would it help? Is India safer thanks to this instability? Or would it push the Chinese leadership to try and keep that border active? And secondly, we have the BRICS summit coming up in the second half. Do you think she will show up?
So now the first thing is, when it comes to Taiwan, there are a lot of contradictions. One is she has been using a lot of gray zone operations, and he has been inching gradually towards Taiwan's shores. And he has achieved a lot. I mean, when you look at Chinese Navy and its gray zone operations, China has achieved substantially in South China Sea and also around Taiwan. The problem is, as we saw in the recent Justice Mission 2025 exercises, he has already reached the upper ceiling of all these gray zone operations. Now, from here onwards, he has to get into active conflict. But that is a very dicey situation. He can lose all of his gains if the conflict becomes active. And if the conflict becomes active, he doesn't know how Japan, how South Korea, and how Americans are going to react. Because Taiwan and South China Sea are core security agendas, even in the latest national security strategy. So he's a bit careful. Second is, he's not very sure of PLA. I mean, he isn't sure that PLA can deliver him results. Obviously, the inventory is pretty good, but the people are a weakness. I mean, even the Air Force, Air Marshal would be a better judge for this. The Air Force has a lot of toys, but when it comes to operations, the training is very centralized control. The pilots do not have much leverage to fly here and there. I mean, they have to stick to whatever the ground control is saying, and their sort of method of operation is very strict and kind of, how would I say, complex. For us, when it comes to pilots and officers, the individual innovation, individual insight is far more important. And the third one, if there is a Taiwan contingency, and this is my personal view, it's not there is a lot of this anxiety in the Chinese discourse that what if India acts as a strategic opportunist? So if we are engaged in the East, and what if the southwest underbelly of China is somehow not attacked, but all India has to do is open this possibility of a two-front contingency. So what happens is almost like 200 to 230,000 troops in the Western Theater Command are locked there. All the mountain acclimatized troops are locked. All the air assets, all the ISR assets, they'll be locked. And even the Indian Navy, if it starts acting far more proactively in the Indian Ocean, the Chinese Navy will get into trouble. So the amount of escalation which Beijing would be able to do in a Taiwan scenario will become limited. So the anxiety is definitely there. We don't have to do anything. We just need to start becoming proactive on the LSE and Indian Ocean.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think this has been a very rich discussion. And the one line summary, I think, would be the three threats were China, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And the message from the panel is India needs to strengthen its defenses, both through import, through acquisitions, and through Atmanirbharta's strengthening itself, and to be catching up on lost time and building defenses further. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for coming.